This show from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
A very good morning to you. It is Saturday, the 22nd of August, 2026. It is 9 a.m. here on Teachers Talk Radio, which means that this is the Saturday Breakfast Show with me, your host, Darren Lester. Good morning. How are you? How has your week been? Mine has been mixed. I think the fact that I've pause to think about it means that it has been mixed. Let's kind of address the elephant in the room. The thing that I'm going to talk about, even though I told myself I wouldn't, and that was GCSE Results Day. I managed to not talk about A-level Results Day last week, which I was very happy about. And I do try not to talk about Results Day because I don't think that mine is a voice that needs to be added to this conversation. Everybody talks about Results Day. Everybody has an opinion, has a thought. Everyone has analyzed the data. Everyone has opined on the new specifications, the new exams. I don't have anything new to add to that conversation. And so apart from my kind of regular tirade about how they're not our results, I don't usually have anything to say about it. But I did post on LinkedIn on Wednesday evening as we were kind of going into Thursday, kind of against my better judgment, quite frankly. I wasn't going to make the post. And I think the fact that only about 5 people have seen it kind of explains why I wasn't going to make it. But I feel like it's something that I ultimately was glad I got off my chest. And actually, for me, just the process of writing that post kind of put Results Day in a new light for me. It kind of reframed it for me. It made me realize something about my own attitude towards it, which now that we are, a whole calendar year away from the next set of Results Days, I think is probably worth exploring a little bit. So in the post, I kind of explained again that I don't believe in the whole our results narrative. I've spoken about this at length on the show before. I did not sit an exam this exam season, therefore I do not have results. Therefore, I don't need to say our results. That's my opinion on it. I don't want to take away from my students by claiming any kind of responsibility for the results that they got because they are the ones who sat the exam. And teaching and learning is a partnership. This is something else that I talk about quite a lot here. It is the teaching and learning process. And yes, I did the teaching part, but that really doesn't mean anything, particularly in terms of exam results, if they didn't do the learning part. And I think I've done a whole show on this idea that I can control the teaching. I have a lot less control over the learning. And for that, our students deserve praise. They deserve their own ownership over their results. That's just my opinion on the whole conversation. But Results Day does still make me incredibly stressed. Both sets of Results Days, those middle 2 weeks in August, ever since I became a secondary teacher, have been the worst 2 weeks out of the calendar year for me in terms of my stress. And at first I just thought it was normal that everybody would be stressed out about the results that their kids would be getting. Then I was diagnosed with my anxiety disorder. And suddenly I realized that actually it's not normal, that not every teacher gets as worked up about their students' results as I do. And that kind of, it didn't matter how well I was giving myself my inner monologue of, they're not my results. I'm only responsible for the teaching. All of the stuff that I say, in a case of do as I say and not as I do, it didn't matter how many times I gave myself that same pep talk every single year. I still got very stressed about it. And this year, well, Wednesday night, um, I sat and I tried to tackle it logically. So I sat down and I thought, okay, what exactly is it about GCSE and A level results season that makes me stressed? Because can I do this for another 20, 30 years? Can I spend 2 full weeks over the next 20, 30 Augusts being this stressed out about things? So I sat down and I kind of pulled apart all of the reasons that I could think of why somebody might be stressed about their students' results day. I thought, do I feel like my students' results reflect on my ability to teach? And my honest answer is no, I don't. Because I believe so strongly in that teaching and learning partnership, because I believe very much that I, as the teacher, am at most 50% of this equation. Um, so it's not that. Do I worry about what other teachers might think of me based on my results? Well, again, no, because I don't publish my results. I don't tell people, or I said it. I don't publish my students' results. I don't generally tell people what my students got because that's my students' business, not anybody else's. I do, interestingly, sometimes feel like not talking about my students' results gives a message, suggests that my students' results are something to be ashamed of, and I think that's really interesting, particularly in, the rise of the teacher influencer and the rise of people looking for things that might feel like it's giving them an advantage over somebody else. So that was quite an interesting feeling to dissect. Um, but generally, no, I don't think that other teachers judge each other by the results our students get. And quite honestly, if somebody did judge me by my students' results, they're not a teacher that I would want particularly to be friendly with, because that person and I very clearly have different views of what education is and different values. And that's okay. We don't all have to believe the same thing. If you are a teacher who likes to take ownership and to talk about our results, and that works for you, that's brilliant. It's just that clearly our values are not aligned, and that means that we probably wouldn't work very well together. So then I thought back to, well, is it like a holdover from my own results days? And I did hate those. Those made me very anxious because I did feel judged on those. As a inverted commas high achieving kid, like I think most of us were, I did feel like a lot of my own self worth was tied up in my own results. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe it was just a hangover from that. Maybe I've learned to be nervous of results days. And now that they are a big part of my life, that's just why I feel nervous. But everything that I wrote down on this list of, stuff that I'm stressed about, stuff that concerns me about results days, I was like, none of this is logical. None of this is rational. None of this actually relates to the results that are coming out, the job that I have done as a teacher. And so while I talk quite openly about my anxiety, about my depression, because I think that these are important conversations for us as educators to have, particularly as we kind of touched on at the beginning of last week's show, where we are seeing increasing numbers of losses in the profession, um, due to how people are feeling, the state of people's mental health. I think it's good to have these conversations. And so I had to kind of come to the conclusion that a lot of what I feel when it comes to results days is a result of how my brain works. You know, those misfiring synapses, the too much cortisol, the lack of dopamine, whatever, you know, all those things that we're told are responsible for depression, for anxiety. And on realizing that, I was like, okay, cool, that's great. I can, you know, I can remind myself of this next year. That's brilliant. But then I got to thinking that I'm obviously not the only teacher who must feel this way, because I'm not the only teacher who has depression and anxiety. And I've been very lucky in my career that I've not worked with people who have talked about our results, who have not held me personally responsible for an underperforming student. To the extent that, if I'm very honest, sometimes I hear the horror stories of, you know, teachers being belittled, teachers being reamed out in the head teacher's office during the feedback meetings, and I thought, oh, that can't possibly be true. I know that it is. And so I'm going to send my apologies to anybody whose story I've heard. And I've thought that, because I know that you've got no reason to lie. I know that these things logically could happen. I am just in a privileged enough position that I have never experienced it for myself. So it's difficult to believe based on my experience, but that doesn't mean that it's not true. And I start to worry then about the people whose brains work like mine does, and who already feel like they've let their students down because they got an 8 instead of a 9, like I said on LinkedIn, or just feel like they have this increased worry, this increased concern, this increased anxiety, whatever it might be, over results. And then they are pulled into a SLT office, and they are given a proper talking to, or worse, because of something over which they had no control, because of exam results that, for exams that they didn't sit, because of exam results for exams that they didn't write the questions for, that they didn't see until after the students had come out of the hall, in most cases until the next day. And I think even the strongest, most stoic person would struggle with those kinds of interactions, with being held responsible, with being blamed, being shouted at, being bullied as a result of that. And I dread to think how some of my colleagues, um, who have had those experiences and whose brains work the same way that mine do, or whose brains misfire in the same way that mine does, I suppose, how they've responded to that and how they feel about that. So, as much as it's a cliche, I am going to kind of put out a plea to SLT, to head teachers, to anybody who will be having those conversations over the coming weeks, about results, to remember to be kind, to remember to keep things in proportion, to remember that you don't know what the person you are talking to has been through, to remember that maybe that person's internal monologue has said the same thing that you're saying and worse already. So they've already had this conversation, albeit with themselves, a week, 2 weeks before, and now they're having to have it again with you. And just be kind. Just keep in mind the reality of what GCSE and A level results are, which is the results that the students achieved when they sat those exams. Because ultimately, that is what we are talking about. And not all SLT, I know this, not all head teachers. And in fact, I would like to think that it's not most, it's not the vast majority. I would like to think it's probably not even 1%. And the people who do respond like that are probably not the people, quite honestly, who sit and listen to education podcasts on a Saturday morning. So they're probably not going to hear my warning. So I guess to the rest of us, to those of us who are here right now, and are here because we care very deeply about education, as demonstrated by the fact that we give up our Saturday mornings to listen to my ramblings. Um, Support your colleagues, support each other. If you are in a situation where maybe some of your colleagues do have a less than stellar meeting with the head, check in with them, make sure that they're okay. And again, do the same on social media. If you are aware of a colleague that is in a school 300 miles from you, but from past posts, or from conversations that you've had with them, because maybe you met them at a conference and that's why you follow them, and you know that they're going to have a difficult conversation, check in with them. Just remember that as much as I like to bang the drum for not our results, and as much as I personally will fight tooth and nail to make it recognized that they are not our results, that they are the students' results, that we are at most 50% responsible, but that then is also recognizing that the people who wrote the exams have a responsibility for results. The people who marked the exams have a responsibility for results. The people who set grade boundaries have a responsibility for results. There are all sorts of things that are responsible for that list of numbers in front of you on the desk when you go in for that meeting, that have got nothing to do with you as the teacher. And I think that even when those conversations go well, and even when you've got lovely SLT, like the vast majority are, it's important to remember those things so that we don't beat ourselves up too much about things over which we had very little control, but also on the flip side, so that we don't grow ourselves an ego thinking how great we are, once again, based on things over which we are only a cog in the system. The exams that we take at the end of a course, be it GCSE, A level, SATs, whatever, they're a product that we buy into. They're a course that we buy to teach. And it might not always be the stuff that we want to teach. It might not always be the things that we think are most valuable, because there is a bit of a disconnect between the teachers and the exam boards. And so I think it's important for us to also remember, if we are weighing up our value as teachers, that the stuff that we are teaching is in fact a product that we have bought in to teach. It's not necessarily our specialty. It's not necessarily the thing that we think is the best use of our time. It's not necessarily the thing that we think is the best learning, but it's what the people who wrote the exams, who wrote the specs, think is the best thing. And we're balancing those expectations as well. There are a lot of moving parts in a terminal exam system where the teachers don't write that final exam, and where the teachers don't grade that final exam. And while we are incredibly important as teachers, while we are the ones who are responsible for bringing that subject to life, for bringing that knowledge that the product we're buying in says is going to be assessed, we are one of those moving parts. And in this case, let's not forget how important and how responsible the other moving parts are.
In education, we all want recruitment to be fair and inclusive because the gender pay gap won't disappear without clear, practical steps in how we hire. Recent national research shows schools are already taking meaningful action. 40% of leaders now include pay or progression details in adverts. 35% highlight well-being support, and around 1 in 5 are using anonymised shortlisting to reduce bias. Teaching vacancies, the Department for Education's free official job listing service, makes these steps easier, with clear salary fields, flexible working filters, and an application format that supports blind recruitment. It also removes previous salary questions so candidates are assessed on their skills and experience rather than their past pay. For your next hire or your next role, go online and search Teaching Vacancies Gov UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week says a new similar schools model to be used by Ofsted from September won't consider a setting's geographical location, leading to concern it won't adequately consider context. Ofsted has said the model will help strengthen how a school's context is taken into account by inspectors, allowing them to examine performance both compared to national benchmarks and to other schools in a similar context. The data will also be available to schools to identify areas for improvement and connect with others. Experts say there are major oversights with the plan, including a lack of consideration of a school's location and the omission of data on pupil ethnicity. Full details on how the proposed model will work can be found online, as well as comment from education leaders. The BBC covers comments from newly appointed Education Secretary Lucy Powell, who says that making sure the student loan system is fair is at the top of her in-tray. She says she stands by comments she made in February when she called interest rates for graduates with Plan 2 loans egregious. She said she was committed to looking at the issue, although acknowledged she can't make any promises about changes. Plan 2 loans were taken out by students in England between September 2012 and July 2023, and they are still issued in Wales. Graduates pay back what they earn above the repayment threshold at a rate of 9%. In November last year, then Chancellor Rachel Reeves said the repayment threshold would be frozen at £29,385 instead of rising with inflation, resulting in earlier repayments for many. More details can be found on the BBC News website. BBC Channel Islands says Guernsey will be providing 2 teachers and a part-time head teacher for Sark's only school from September. It follows the departure of the former head teacher, who was suspended after an investigation in March and later had employment terminated. The Guernsey Education Committee agreed to provide the staff with Sark covering the costs. The school, which caters for pupils aged 3 to 13, is the only one on the island. A spokesperson for the Education Committee in Guernsey said it wanted to ensure pupils across the bailiwick had the best possible education. Finally, The Guardian says that swimming classes have started again in Gaza after 3 years of war. Hundreds of children are learning to float, doggy paddle and take their first strokes in 5 makeshift sea pools built from sandbags and rubble. Amjad Tantesh, who founded Gaza's first swimming academy more than 2 decades ago, has mobilised dozens of volunteers this summer to create the string of pools on the beaches of central Gaza, with tarpaulins providing some shade from the fierce Mediterranean sun. In the morning, they hold free classes for children whose parents were killed in the Israeli attacks. There has been no formal schooling for 3 years, and almost all school buildings have been destroyed, so the swimming classes bring some relief. Full details can be found online. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Thanks, Joe. So, years and years ago now, I was sitting in the staff room, having a chat with some other teachers, and the Senko in the school that I was working in at that time told the story of when she learned to drive. She learnt as an adult, and her very first driving lesson, she sat in the car with the instructor. You know, they were making small talk as they were going through whatever it is you do in your first driving lesson. I can't drive. I've never had a driving lesson, so I'm not even going to pretend that I know what goes on when you're learning. But you know, they were chatting, and the subject of my then colleague's job came up, and she said his face fell when she said that she was a teacher, and this driving instructor told her that this was because teachers were the worst people to try to teach. And he kind of didn't really elaborate on that. So we sat in the staff room and we speculated on why that might be. But that story has always stuck with me. This was very, very early on in my teaching career. So, you know, it was easily 17, 18 years ago. And it's always stuck with me. And I've been reflecting on it over the past couple of weeks while I've been thinking about the inset days that are coming up. Because I have sat through what I have considered to be some truly dreadful inset days, where I have been resentful about not being able to be in my classroom, where I've thought about the to-do list that won't be to done until we have been through whatever the speaker du jour is talking about. And then you go and you listen to the speaker and you don't understand why you're there or how what they're talking about is relevant to your to your practice. And then I've also been the speaker, aware that I've been taking up time on people's inset days, trying to make sure that what I'm talking about is worthwhile, is going to add value, is worth them not being in their own classrooms, planning their lessons, making their PowerPoints, doing their photocopying, moving their furniture around, tidying off their tables, cleaning off the graffiti that the summer school has left, you know, whatever whatever it is that might be on that to-do list. And so as I've been thinking about this over the past couple of weeks, and then as I've been thinking about CPD more generally over the past 18 months or so, I started to think about whether we as a profession actually are good learners. In theory, we should be the best learners for a few reasons. First of all, we know what it's like to stand up in front of a classroom full of people and try to educate them. So we should be very sympathetic to that. And even if we're not particularly interested in whatever the CPD presenter is talking about, even if we would rather be off doing our photocopying, whatever it might be, we should, in theory, be sympathetic towards what this teacher is trying to teach us. We should be sympathetic towards the fact that they think it's valuable and SLT thinks it's valuable, therefore we should pay attention, in the same way that when somebody comes into my French class or my Mandarin class or whatever it might be, I think that they should pay attention because I think it's valuable and the head teacher thinks it's valuable enough for me to be able to offer these classes. We should be great learners because we know what makes a great learner. We know the profile of good learners and we should be able to emulate those things. We should be the best learners because we are very educated in our subjects, in our pedagogies. And so we have, you know, we've been in classes, we have sat through them, we've observed them, we know what it is to sit and listen to a lecture and take notes. You don't get a degree in education, you don't get a postgrad certificate in education, you don't get a degree in your subject, you know, whatever it is that you've done without being able to do that. All of these things put together should make us amazing learners. So why is it that this particular driving instructor was so adamant that teachers were the worst people to try to teach? And at first, when I kind of had this idea for the show, I thought maybe it was just an anecdote. This might just be this one bloke's experience of teaching teachers. Maybe he just got unlucky and then formed an opinion. So I did what I always do, and I went to the literature. And it turns out it's not just this one man's opinion. There is, in fact, a lot of research that has happened about teachers as learners and how we respond to learning, how we respond to learning opportunities that we are given. And I'm going to be very honest, it doesn't always paint us in the best light. So that's what we're going to talk about this morning. I've picked one paper in particular, a 2006 qualitative study that came out in the journal Teaching and Teacher Education. And it's written by Ingrid van Ekelen, Jan Vermont, and Henny Boshausen. And it's called Exploring Teachers' Will to Learn. So this is kind of going to be the base of the show. This is what I have built, what we're going to talk about around. I've pulled in some other different papers because, like I said, there was a shameful amount. And we're just going to have a chat. So if you want to join in today with the conversation, if you are outraged by anything that comes up, or if you want to kind of confess, actually, yeah, I sit there and I doodle in inset and I don't really pay attention because I don't see how it's relevant, then there are a couple of ways that you can do that. If you are listening live via YouTube or X, you can just leave me a comment. I will read it out and we can engage that way. If you are listening live elsewhere, maybe over on ttradio.org, ttradio.org, sorry, then you can message me over on Blue Sky. I am at Mr. D. Lester. That's MRDLESTER, all one word, over on that particular app. Again, I will read out your message and we can engage that way. But for now, let's face some uncomfortable truths, shall we? The central concept of this paper was what Van Ekelen, Vermont, and Boshausen term a will to learn. And basically, they said that a huge amount of professional learning opportunities that are available to us in our day-to-day workplace lives go unused. We don't engage with the CPD that is offered to us. Now, that was the very first thing that made me bristle, because a lot of the criticism I hear about CPD is that it's not very widely available, that it's not always accessible. A part of my ed, I promised myself that I would get through this show without mentioning my thesis, and I don't know why I thought that, because we're talking about CPD. But a big part of my ed thesis is about CPD and kind of how language teachers perceive the CPD that they've received, what kind of CPD they want. And a lot of the feedback that I've been getting, a lot of the responses that I've been hearing in interviews that I've conducted, has been that generally CPD is not very accessible. If we know it exists, then we can't do it because it's too expensive, or because our school won't give us the time to go out and do it. They won't let us be free for the day. They won't get a supply teacher in so that we can go on the course. If it's an evening course, they won't give us back the time in lieu. And a lot of people have said, I'm willing to do things in my own time, love teaching, love my subject, very much willing to go, yeah, okay, I'll go to this meeting, I'll go to this course after school. I won't be paid for it, but that's okay. I'll do it because the will is there. But when so much of our job relies on goodwill, eventually something does have to break. And quite often, professional development is one of the first things to go, because we're chugging along quite nicely. Thank you very much. Um, so I found this quite interesting. This idea that there are lots of opportunities available, but we just don't use them because it goes against what I'm being told. And that itself, I think, is very interesting. First of all, we keep in mind that this paper, of course, is from 2006. So this predates kind of my teaching career. And what I've noticed since I started in 2007 is that the number of opportunities available to us has actually decreased. So it could be that before I started teaching, there were lots of CPD opportunities that were going unused, and we've just kind of got this out of date conceit to start with. And that happens in research. Things change over 20 years. That itself is not a problem, and it doesn't mean that there is no value in the research. We just have to recontextualize it a little bit. Or it could just be that we're not using them. It could be that this problem persists. Again, maybe because we don't know that they're there, maybe because we're not being given the time, the money, the opportunity to make use of them. In justifying their opinion, they cited earlier work by Quackman, who did a whole inventory of teachers' participation across a whole bunch of different learning activities. And they found, this was in 2003, that there were lots and lots of CPD opportunities being offered to teachers, and they just weren't being taken up. So, Van Eckelen et al., they had a knowledge base to go on. They also pointed out that when we think about educational innovation in general, the majority of innovations that we have in education end up failing because we as teachers, after undergoing a big period of change, will quite often abandon whatever new behavior we're supposed to have adopted, whatever new strategy, new style we are supposed to have brought in, and we fall back into our comfortable own routines. I can't remember where I read this, but somebody wrote that as teachers, we tend to privilege and prioritize our own experience and our own sense of, I know what I'm doing, over anything new that is coming out. And in theory, CPD is supposed to be about exploring the new, or at least bringing new to old, and having us change our behaviors, change our teaching practice to make it better for our young people. Now, veteran teachers in the audience, I know that you will be sitting there going, yes, Darren, that's what CPD is supposed to be. But we all know that we've sat through the same behavior management strategy, CPD, brand new innovation 3 times. It's just called something different, which is fair and very valid. I used to hate it when people would say that to me when I started, but now I realize it's true. But every time something is repackaged, every time a technique is repurposed, every time it's rebranded, there is usually a kernel of novelty to it. They don't just rebrand, well, most people don't just rebrand these things for the sake of rebranding them. I think there is a conversation to be had about CPD as business, particularly CPD as cottage business, as a cottage industry, and how evidence informed the CPD that we are getting actually is, versus how much of it is just teachers going, well, in my experience, this, and this, and then leaving it at that. But it is interesting because I think it's true. Thinking about my own responses to CPD I've sat through, I know that I've been told that I need to adopt a specific teaching practice or a specific behavior management practice. And I've been told why. And then I've tried for a few weeks And then when I don't think anybody is monitoring it anymore, I slip back to the things that have always worked for me. And I don't know why I do that. I don't. And I think that if I, as somebody who is very clearly obsessed with pedagogical literature, is going to do that, then other teachers who are less interested in evidence informed teaching and more interested in other aspects of pedagogy that I'm not so interested in, they are going to fall back into old routines as well. So I find that really interesting. Their starting assumption then for this whole paper is that professional learning isn't actually self-evident. There are these occasions where we as the teacher simply do not learn, even when we are provided with an opportunity to do so, and even when the workplace conditions to facilitate that are there. And their proposed explanation for this is what they've called the will to learn. And they define this as being a psychological state in which the learner has a desire to learn, and that is, according to their argument, a necessary prerequisite for any actual workplace learning activity to occur. And I find this really interesting because at first I wanted to dismiss it. And I think I was being a bit defensive, and I think my teacher ego got in the way. And I was like, no, 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 no. If we're told that something is important, if we're told that this is the best new pedagogy, then we will do it. Even if we don't want to, we will do it. And then I thought about my learners in my classroom. And I thought, they don't learn just because I tell them it's important to. If they did, it would make our job so much easier. My learners don't learn just because they have got a timetabled day of learning. And when you ask children about what they've learnt, where they've learnt, it will always be in the subjects that they find most interesting, the subjects that they think are most important to them, the subjects that they perceive have an immediate impact and relevance to their lives. That's a will to learn. They will learn where they see that they need to, they will learn where they want to, because that's an interesting little linguistic side note about this word will. It comes from the Old English verb wollen, which meant to want. So it's a desire. It's why we say where there's a will, there's a way. Where you want to do something, you will find a way to do it. And if that's true of my learners in my classroom, yes, they're teenagers. Yes, we can come up with all sorts of reasons about how their brains aren't developed, prefrontal cortex and all of that good stuff. But ultimately, it is the same thing. If I can see with my own two eyes in my classroom that my students learn better when they want to, as opposed to when they don't want to, it kind of makes sense that I would be the same. And I think that that is something that we all feel and we all recognize as being true, even if we might state it differently. Because again, how many times have you thought or said, I would love to do some CPD on X, Y, and Z. I would love to do some CPD on gamifying reading, like we talked about last week, because you're an English teacher. Or I would love to do some CPD on sentence building, because I'm an MFL teacher. And you've sat through CPD about things that you have struggled to relate back to your day-to-day practice, your own teaching experience. And you've thought, I would have loved to have learned about something else instead. That's a will to learn. It's just not necessarily a will to learn the thing that you are being presented with. So I kind of got over myself eventually. And I realized that actually, yeah, I do agree that will to learn is important. And I don't think it's a bad thing for us to recognize that. I don't think it's a bad thing for us to go, I do want to learn. I just don't want to learn this thing that is being put in front of me. I want to learn something different. I have my own goals for the year. I've done my performance management review. I know what I've decided I want to work on this year, and that's what I want to learn about. And this is why personalized CPD is the best way to go. So what I like, especially then, having dug into this will to learn a bit deeper, is how these researchers differentiate it from some of the surrounding concepts that can easily be conflated with a will to learn. Because a will to learn is not the same thing as an ability to learn. Again, we're teachers. We know that we can learn stuff. We've all got at least undergraduate degrees. And in a lot of cases, particularly for secondary teachers, postgraduate certificates. Lots of us have got postgraduate degrees. So we know that we actually have an ability to learn. And that ability to learn involves reflection, it involves generalization, and it involves formulating learning goals. And again, I think it's quite important to separate that out, because that generalization is something that maybe we ought to be doing when we're sitting through CPD that we don't particularly want to be there for. We should maybe be looking for reasons or ways that we can apply what they're talking about to our own practice. The question is the will there? Do we want to? Because if we don't want to, we won't. It's not the same as the motivation or the interest to learn, because as the researchers point out in this paper, motivation and interest tends to have a very directional, very narrowing quality. You're motivated towards something specific, whereas a will to learn is more like a general openness or a general desire to see something new, to get rid of your attachments to everything that you have been doing for 40 years, and to see the novelty, by which I mean newness, not like something that can eventually be abandoned. I'm using novelty in its literal sense. And to see that as something worth exploring in its own right. It's also not the same as an intention to learn, because an intention implies a deliberate, planned, goal-directed act, whereas a will to learn can and does proceed a lot more spontaneous, informal, and even unplanned learning. So again, if you have an intention to learn, you might seek out a CPD that is relevant to your specific practice. If you have a will to learn, that relevance is actually a little bit less important, because you are finding learning opportunities all around in just about everything that you are doing.
In education, we all want recruitment to be fair and inclusive, because the gender pay gap won't disappear without clear, practical steps in how we hire. Recent national research shows schools are already taking meaningful action. 40% of leaders now include pay or progression details in adverts. 35% highlight well-being support, and around 1 in 5 are using anonymised shortlisting to reduce bias. Teaching vacancies, the Department for Education's free official job listing service, makes these steps easier, with clear salary fields, flexible working filters, and an application format that supports blind recruitment. It also removes previous salary questions, so candidates are assessed on their skills and experience rather than their past pay. For your next hire or your next role, go online and search Teaching Vacancies Gov UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
Okay, this next section was another bit that made me bristle, but I've kind of learned to accept that. I've learned to kind of sit with the discomfort as a teacher of people trying to categorize us, and to say some things that might be a little bit uncomfortable, because I think that's a good way to learn, even if the only thing we're learning from it is how we are perceived. So I am going to caveat before I start, because I think the caveat is important. This was a very small study. They only interviewed 14 teachers in one secondary school in the Netherlands. So we're not able to say this is applicable to everybody. We're not generalizing this out to everybody. The purpose of qualitative work is not to generalize, it's to describe specific experiences. But I think, having read a decent chunk of research, that quite often the experiences that we find described are a little bit more universal than we might like to believe. Which is why I use this kind of research on the show. It's why we talk about it. So they categorized these 14 teachers into 3 groups. I'd be interested to see which group we all fall into, but don't worry about telling me, because I understand you might not want to admit to being certain groups. Group number 1 is the one I think that made me bristle the most. They were the teachers who, and I quote, "do not see why there's a need to learn." And again, this is one of those things where I am privileged in that I don't think I've ever met or worked with somebody who falls into this category. Not completely. I don't think I've ever met a teacher who, in one fell swoop, has said, "No, I've got nothing to learn." For me, I don't like the idea of this attitude. And, my apologies to anybody out there who is thinking, "Oh, yeah, that's me." Um, I've always said for myself that if there's a moment where I feel like there's nothing left in teaching for me to learn, I need to leave the profession, because then there is no more challenge in it. There's no more novelty. There's nothing. That's the point where you're just cashing in a paycheck that is not really worth the amount of time that you have to spend to earn it, quite honestly. So for me, the idea of learning new stuff through my teaching is really important. And I think the vast majority of teachers, I think all teachers that I've met, feel the same. So I'm not sure, from my experience, I've not met anybody who falls into this camp. But apparently, you are out there. There were 4 distinct characteristics of this group. The first is that they held very tightly to their established teaching habits. They showed very little openness to other people, be that students or colleagues or anybody who came in with new information. They tended to blame their students or the wider educational system when things went wrong, instead of reflecting critically on their own role. And then they struggled to describe any specific learning experience of their own at all, even when they were asked directly. So these are the teachers that you probably avoid in the staff room, because the moment you sit down next to them, they're going to complain about something. That's kind of how I've contextualized them. One teacher in this group was asked a question about a recent educational innovation, and Dutch educational innovations tend to come out of The Hague. And so this teacher said, "The gentlemen in The Hague decide which direction we must go, and we, as foot soldiers, must follow that direction." So again, a very negatively framed, very closed off idea of what education is and what education should be. It's interesting because I feel like on the surface, that statement is quite open because the teacher seems to be saying that it shouldn't be up to this group of gentlemen in The Hague to decide what is taught, to decide what schools should do. It feels a lot like they are saying schools should have a bit more autonomy. But that framing of teachers then as foot soldiers, that's the thing that brings it down. That's the thing that adds that negative layer to it. Another, when asked directly what they had learnt from a difficult moment in their classroom, didn't actually say anything. They sat in silence and didn't answer that question. Then, when they were prompted to answer, they said somewhere, sometimes, you can probably say, "Oh yes, I should think about that." But for the rest, you just keep on moving. And so again, there's an idea that these specific types of teachers, they recognize that there are opportunities to learn, and they recognize that maybe they should take those opportunities, but most of the time they don't. And I think that justification is quite interesting. For the rest, you just keep on moving. Because how many times have we all used that as our own justification not to do something? I don't have time. I have to keep going. I have to plow through my curriculum. I've got too much to do. That's that keep on moving mentality. The second group are teachers who are wondering how to learn. I quite like that. And I think I quite like that because it seems quite sweet to me that there are groups of teachers out there who are unsure about how to learn. This group are not unwilling. They do want to improve. They want to be better as teachers. And actually, as a little aside, that's something that the paper doesn't tackle, but I do think is very important for us to think about when we consider ourselves as learners, is the vulnerability that we have to exhibit when we say that we want to learn or are willing to learn something new. Again, I've spoken at length about this on the show before, so we're not going to go too much into it today. But as teachers, we want to be the best because right now we have a group of learners sitting in front of us, learning from us, learning from the teacher that we are right now. And we don't want to feel like we're letting those learners down. Again, kind of looping back around to what I said about results at the top of the show. We don't want to feel like we're letting those learners down by not being the very best that we can be. And so it's actually really easy for us to bury our heads in the sand and pretend that we are the very best that we can be right now, because then we don't have to worry about letting those learners down. But I think if we do that and we ignore opportunities for improvement because we don't want to admit that there are places that we want to improve. We don't want to feel less than in the eyes of our colleagues. We don't want to think that our head of department thinks we're a rubbish teacher because we've admitted that we need some help on behavior management. We are doing a disservice to the future children who are coming. The kids in front of us right now in 3 years' time, when we still haven't learnt to plug those gaps. And so again, it's kind of about getting over that concern of what people think about us, which can be difficult when people are talking about teachers all of the time. When we get a lot of negative press, it's very easy to kind of go in and try and protect yourself. But I think it is important to not worry about that and to embrace these learning opportunities so that we can be the best that we can for those kids who are coming up to us. Anyway, these wondering how to learn teachers, they're the ones who want to learn, they want to improve, but they don't know how to take that first step. They actually don't know how to initiate that improvement process. And so as a result, they don't make very many resolutions, for want of a better word. They don't make many plans for their CPD. They might take an opportunity when it comes along, but they don't seek anything out. One teacher in that group described the lesson that had gone badly. They had checked their students' work over and over with no real change in their approach. And then they said, very visibly frustrated, I really think I gave a bad lesson, but how do I improve that? I don't know how to improve that. So they recognize that something has gone wrong. They express that desire to get better. But then at that last hurdle, they fall, because they fall back into the I don't know what to do, instead of just rephrasing that question slightly. Power of words. We talk about this all the time on a Saturday morning. Instead of rephrasing it slightly into what can I do? And actually seeking out that help for improvement. Now, to be fair, maybe you wouldn't ask that of a researcher, especially if you don't know very much about the researcher. If you don't know if they're a teacher or not, you don't know that they've got the best pedagogy to advise you on what to do. You know, there are all sorts of reasons why this might not have come up in this interview. But if they then just sit with, I don't know what to do, and they make that part of their teacher identity, instead of that making that shift to what do I do, and finding somebody who can answer that question, for be it another teacher or a course or a YouTube video or whatever, then they're going to always be stuck in this wondering how to learn phase, which I think is kind of like a limbo. I feel like these teachers are the ones who could go either way. They could slip down into the don't see why there's a need to learn group, because no matter what they do, things don't get better, so why should they learn? Or they could go up into the next group, the eager to learn group that we'll talk about in a minute, because they have found the ways to do it. I feel like the wondering how to learn teachers are maybe like the middle set, where you've got to make sure that you keep them supported. And quite often, they're the ones who get overlooked. Because we talk a lot about people who don't want to engage in CPD, and we talk a lot about people who do every CPD going. And then we've got a middle group who just physically don't know how to access it. Another one of these wondering how to learn teachers, reflecting on a professional development session that they'd had, said very plainly, I really miss the ready to implement suggestions. Tell me what I should do. Now, this is a little bugbear of mine, honestly. How many times have we done that and sat in a CPD session and been frustrated because there wasn't a very clear through line of this is what you should be doing on Monday morning. Here's the handout that you can use. Here's the worksheet that you can use. And the thing is, while it might seem like that's the best type of CPD, because it gives you something very practical that you can do in your classroom to save you some time on Monday morning, it's leaving us in a state of helplessness, because it's giving us the resource to use, but it's not then showing us how we can use whatever pedagogy underlying that resource in future, whatever pedagogy is underlying that resource in future. We just have a one-off worksheet that we can use. So if we are picking our CPD based on who is giving out the most worksheets, we're not necessarily actually as interested in CPD as we think we are, because what we are looking for is somebody to tell us exactly what to do. Somebody to give us a script instead of somebody to help us develop our pedagogy. And I feel really bad saying that, because I know that that is the type of CPD that teachers tend to want. And I've been there. I've wanted worksheets to give out. I've wanted books to read. I've wanted to be given things by other people who have tried them and have vetted them and are telling me this works. And it's great if it's been tried and vetted and it works. But again, that then means I've got one worksheet. What do I do with the rest of the time? I'm not gonna rag on those kinds of CPDs because, like I said, I've sat through them, I've wanted them, I've believed that they were the best type myself. It's only kind of when I've been reflecting on this paper that I've started to pick holes in the idea. But what I think is really important for us to think about is that those teachers, the wondering how to learn teachers, are the ones who really want to learn, but they're structurally failed by going to these CPDs that don't actually meet them where they are. Because again, they don't provide a good pedagogical understanding, they just dish out a worksheet. The third group were the teachers who were eager to learn. They were the ones who didn't just want to improve. It wasn't like an abstract, I know this has gone wrong, but what do I do? They were the ones who took action to change. They were critical of their own performance across almost every situation that the researchers observed. They had a lot of insight into their own strengths and their own weaknesses. Excuse me. And they could, I don't know why I've got hiccups all of a sudden. And they could very clearly describe specific learning experiences that they had been through and their outcomes. For example, there was one teacher who was talking about a visually impaired student. And they said very simply, I want to know how I can support him in the classroom. And so I went on a course that dealt with this specific subject. Another one described a very challenging student and using them as a source of self-reflection. There's a student who is really good, they said. He constantly challenges me with very difficult questions. Did I do that to intimidate or just to explain some algebra? And then within that eager to learn group, there is also an interesting subgroup. And they were the teachers who have what the paper calls a yearning to learn. And one of these teachers, when they were describing lesson preparation, said, although I know my subject very, very well, I still prepare my lessons every day. I look at what we're supposed to do. I look at what steps we must take. I look at where the students may run into trouble. I also do every exercise that they have to do so that I know exactly what they experience. I love this teacher. This teacher is who I want to be when I grow up. And again, I think that there is nothing wrong with being in any of these groups. Do I feel a little bit good about myself because I am relating to the yearning to learn person? Absolutely. Am I going to think less of a colleague because they are one of the don't see that there's a need to learn people? No, because we're all different. We all have different priorities. But what I found really interesting about this is that all of a sudden, a lot of other issues that I have clicked into place. So, for example, I take real umbrage with the idea of using AI to plan lessons for me. I hate the idea of typing into ChatGPT, Claude, whatever it might be. I am teaching a lesson on the Japanese TEF form. Please plan the lesson for me. And then delivering what lesson comes out of the AI. And I do hate it because it means that I'm just giving ownership over my lesson to a robot. But actually, what I realized when I was reading this paper is the issue that I personally have with that, and why I can't implement that into my own practice, is because I fall into this yearning to learn category. Because I, as a teacher, do the same thing. I feel like I have deep subject knowledge. I feel like I've got lots and lots of experience, but I still want to look at exactly what I'm going to do with my students. I want to look at what steps we're going to take to get there. I want to look at where the students might run into trouble. And I want to do the exercises so that I can figure out where they're going to fall. I want to do all of those things. I want to meet this teacher, quite honestly, because I'm fanboying a little bit. But that is how I want to practice. And again, this is, as a little aside, why I do think reading literature is really important, because you can learn from other people's experiences. So particularly when you look at these qualitative studies, you can see what other people have said, and it can help to shine a light on your own practice or your own feelings that you might not have been able to see before. I think that there is, again, some vulnerability in being that teacher, because I think sometimes it can feel like, and it can look like, being over prepared, doing the exercises, taking the notes, makes it look like you need a bit of a comfort blanket. Maybe it makes it look like your subject knowledge isn't as strong, and so you need the notes there to refer back to. But it doesn't really matter what other people think. What matters is your own teacher identity. What type of teacher are you? And how are you practicing to bring that identity to life, to be the type of teacher you want to be the type of teacher you are? So yeah, I like that teacher. I think that quote is a good description of like ongoing expertise. It's looking at everything anew, even if it's the same activity that you have done half a dozen times before. You've got these new learners sitting in front of you. They are different children to the ones who have done it before. You might have learned something new since you taught it last year because you're a linguist and you've watched a TV program in your taught language and you've learned a new idiom that applies, or something that you can then bring in. And again, it's that desire to get better, that desire to improve. Now, what's even more interesting is when we go deeper and we can see that there are about 6 different behaviors that underpin these 6 different groups, and they kind of help us to explore and explain why we might be the types of teachers that we are.
In education, we all want recruitment to be fair and inclusive, because the gender pay gap won't disappear without clear, practical steps in how we hire. Recent national research shows schools are already taking meaningful action. 40% of leaders now include pay or progression details in adverts. 35% highlight well-being support, and around 1 in 5 are using anonymised shortlisting to reduce bias. Teaching vacancies, the Department for Education's free official job listing service, makes these steps easier, with clear salary fields, flexible working filters, and an application format that supports blind recruitment. It also removes previous salary questions, so candidates are assessed on their skills and experience rather than their past pay. For your next hire or your next role, go online and search Teaching Vacancies Gov UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
So I kind of see this next couple of minutes as like one of those quizzes in the magazines that my sister used to get when we were little. You know, it was like which Spice Girl are you? And if you've ticked mostly A's, then you are Sporty Spice. And if you've ticked mostly B's, then you are Scary Spice, etc., etc. That's kind of how I feel about these categories of behavior. So let's see how many we tick and what that means about which group we fall into. So category A behavior is how alert you are when you are circulating in your classroom. Do you notice what's going on in your room and do you adapt? Do you stop your lesson if it's not going very well? Do you start again if it's very clear that the students don't know what is happening rather than just persevering on regardless? Category B, are you open to other people? Do you pay attention to and try to genuinely understand individual students, individual colleagues, instead of relying on broad, fixed assumptions about them? Now, what was interesting about this category in particular is that about half of the teachers in the sample didn't really get to know their students as individuals. They tended to overgeneralize and over attribute behavior to fixed personality traits rather than specific classroom circumstances. So, what's interesting about category B is that it probably isn't as telling a behavior when it comes to sorting us into our learning type um, as we might think. But it came up in the paper, so it was worth mentioning. Category C, are you critical of your own role and performance? Now, let's remember that being critical isn't the same as being negative. So if you think that you are the worst teacher in the world, then you might not be being critical about your performance, you're being negative about your performance. A critical teacher will look for specific issues, specific flaws, specific places that things went wrong, and how to address them. A critical teacher will also find things that went well and think about how to replicate that in the future. So, are you critical of your own performance, or are you negative about your own performance? Category D, do you ask yourself questions about how to handle different situations? Do you, when you are helping a child with their maths problem, do you actually ask yourself, what does this child need? How can I help them? How can I model this differently? Do you go through that reflexive dialogue? Category E, do you resolve to improve and take concrete action to do so? And then category F, can you articulate things that you have learnt whilst you have been practicing or when you have come out of a CPD session? Now, I can't tell you which Spice Girl you are based on your answers to those. But I would say the more of those that you've been able to say yes to, the more likely you are to be in that eager to learn group. I think if you said yes to all of them, then you are probably one of those lucky people, in my opinion, in that yearning to learn group. And I would say the more that you've said no to, the more likely you are to be in that don't feel that there is a need to learn group. And again, remember, we're not here to criticize people today. We're not here to say that one group is objectively better than another. We're just here to try and give ourselves some insight into ourselves so that we can think about how we're approaching CPD and so that we can go in on the first day of inset informed about what we're going to sit through and how we might respond to it. The researchers, interestingly, found that about a third of the teachers in their study didn't always translate their resolution into actual action. So the will to learn, and even a stated intention for improvement met a bit of a ceiling at the ability to learn point. There were lots of teachers who said that they wanted to improve, but they were, according to the researchers, looking for somebody to give them the right answer rather than experimenting and constructing experimenting with and constructing their own solutions. And so I think this is why so many people fall into that wondering to how to learn category. And that might, I don't know if I like the phrasing of that, because again, I think it can be a bit of a blow to your teacher ego to say, oh, I wonder how to learn. But I do wonder if this is why so many people go into inset wanting that worksheet, because we want the right answer. We want the thing that is going to help our students right now, the ones who are in front of us. But the thing is, one worksheet is not going to be right for every student, and it's not going to be right for every teacher. Whereas if we are equipped with the pedagogy, if we're equipped with the knowledge, if we're equipped with the how, then we can make it work for ourselves. And I know, being given the worksheet saves you time. You don't have time to sit and think about the how. We don't have time to sit and think about the pedagogy. And that's fair, but we should have time. Because not having time to do these things impedes our teaching, in my opinion. And I think there are other things that we have to do that should actually be jettisoned first, should be the things given to AI before we hand over our lesson planning, before we hand over our reflection, before we hand over the actual business of teaching. Because as teachers, that's what we are employed to do. And again, I know that there are arguments that that's not what the job is anymore, and that when we go into teaching, we know this. But I very firmly believe that it shouldn't be that way. Because I am trained to teach, and I should be teaching. I'm not trained as a counselor. I'm not trained as a policeman. I'm not trained in domestic abuse. There are all sorts of things that I'm expected to do that I am not the right person to do. I am the right person to teach languages. I am the right person to think about pedagogy. And I think it's sad when the thing that we are trained to do, the thing that we've been through university for, the thing that we go to these CPDs about, is actually one of the first things that gets handed over to AI, to a bought-in scheme of work, to somebody else, so that we can focus on the things that we're not trained to do, that is not necessarily within our skill set. So for me, that's a big barrier to learning, is this time that we don't have because there are so many things that have got nothing to do with learning that we need to do. Now, please don't get me wrong. I always feel bad when I say this because I feel like it makes me sound a bit cruel or a bit callous. So please don't misunderstand. I want our children to have the best holistic experience that they can. I recognize that school is probably the place where the majority of safeguarding concerns are going to be raised because of the nature of school. And I do think that children should have these adults doing these things for them, providing these things for them, looking out for them. I just don't think that that needs to be the teacher. I think it needs to be people who are trained and qualified to do these things. And I think there needs to be more funding in education so that those people can have these jobs. But as I am quite often told, I live in a lovely little imaginary world where money is no object. it it apparently doesn't matter that money is being wasted and could be spent elsewhere. But anyway, that's my own little gripe. So yeah, there is the time barrier, there is the cognitive load barrier, there's the headspace barrier. Do I have the headspace to learn a new pedagogy? There's also the experience barrier. I've learnt all these new pedagogies and they've all been touted as the best one. So why do I have to learn this new best one? And I think the reason for that is that pedagogy is often mismarketed, because quite often we are told this is the best one, this is the new one that everybody should be doing, when in fact that's not how pedagogy works. If it were, there would only be one, and all of the research would be looking at how we find the next best one. It wouldn't be still looking at how all of the previous ones can still be applied. The fact is, pedagogy is individual. There are lots of them, and we will all find the individual one that works for us. And we might even need to use different pedagogies with different classes. And so when we sit in the inset being told that this is the brand new thing, when in fact it's a pedagogy that we had an inset about 15 years ago when it was the brand new thing then, and the experienced teacher told us that he'd had a pedagogy about it 15 years before that when it was the brand new thing, we quite often blame the pedagogy for that. And we have this resistance to it because we go, it clearly didn't work in the previous 2 attempts because there wouldn't have been a new one since then. But the new one since then has just been one that somebody got excited about and published about, or somebody got excited about and did a conference about. It's not actually new. Sometimes there are new ones, but generally no. It's just one that suddenly has the limelight. But I think if you know yourself as a teacher and you know your pedagogies, you're not going to be too worried about somebody coming in trying to sell you a brand new one, because you can quite honestly sit there and go, oh yeah, no, I tried that, it didn't work for me, but I'll have a listen, and we'll see what they're saying has changed, and kind of go into it with that open mind. Then there are participation barriers, and that's really important for us to think about, because this is something that quite often gets overlooked. Since COVID, there has been this expectation that CPD will be online in our own time. And we did kind of do this to ourselves. We created a rod for our own back, because during COVID, when we were all in lockdown and we were looking to connect with each other, we did do a lot of online CPD in our own time, because we were looking for a reason to talk to other teachers. And that now has carried over. A lot of the CPD that I deliver, I do on weekends and evenings, because I know that I'm more likely to get people coming to it than if it were during the school day, even though during the school day would actually be more convenient for me. But I know that schools have started to say, no, there's lots of CPD happening in of an evening on the weekend, so you can do that. I'm not going to let you go to the all day. I'm not going to pay for a supply teacher, which means that those all days are starting to disappear and move to online in the weekends and evenings, which means that there's more CPD being offered online during the evening, which means that schools have more of a reason to say, no, I'm not sending you to that all day because you can do it in an evening. And it becomes this cycle. So there is this real barrier to access, whereby if you're not willing or able to give up your weekend or evening, if you are a parent And so getting home to your child at 5:30 is your priority so that you can see them before bedtime. You probably don't want to do a CPD at 5:30. If you care for your parents and so you want to get home after school as quickly as possible to make sure that everything is okay, you probably don't want to stay behind for a CPD. Perhaps you just don't want to spend your unpaid time doing CPD. Now, I'm sure that doesn't actually apply to any of us because, once again, we're here on a Saturday morning listening to an education podcast. So that one probably isn't us, but we have colleagues like that, and that is completely their right. So we have these barriers cropping up that aren't necessarily related to that will to learn, but I think that your will to learn will dictate how willing you are to overcome those barriers. So if we go back to the big question that I asked at the beginning, do teachers make good learners? The answer to that is not as cut and dry as we might have hoped, because we might have hoped that the answer would have been a resounding yes. And the answer is actually yes, some teachers do. Some teachers could, if they have somebody to steer them in the right direction of how to access the information, and some teachers don't. And I'm not sure that there is an issue with any one of those categories. I think it's just good for us to be aware of which category we specifically fall into. I think if you are somebody who offers CPD, maybe you're a head of department and you do the training for your department, it's good for you to think about who in your department falls into which category so that you can tailor what you are offering to each different type. But as long as we are honest with ourselves and each other about what we want to get out of CPD, what we are looking for, which of these categories we fall into, I'm not sure it's necessarily a problem being any of them. So long as we are respectful to the people who come in to do our CPD, I think we're all good. I hope that you have found today reflective. That's my hope for today, that you have thought about, you've reflected on your own learning journey, that you've thought about which of those categories you fall into. Maybe you've decided that those categories are a bit too broad and you've started to think about nuances of them, even not deliberately. Maybe you've just had some idle thoughts. Write them down, put them on a blog, link me to it over on Blue Sky so that I can read it, because I would be interested to see what you think. And engaging with things like this, having those conversations, that is also CPD. That's a will to learn. And I will see you next week. Have yourselves a great rest of the weekend, whatever you are doing. Have a fantastic final week of the holiday if you are still on holiday. I know that not everybody around the world still is, but if you are, as we are in England, then enjoy it. And I shall see you next Saturday morning for our next breakfast. Thank you very much and goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.